It is a strange thing to build your entire life on a foundation of absence, to grow up not knowing where you come from, who loved you first, or why the world decided you were not worth keeping. If you have ever felt like a ghost in your own story, if you have ever had to invent a reason to keep going when the world gave you none, then maybe this will make sense to you. Stay with me, because this story is for people like us, the ones who had to build a family from nothing, the ones who learned that home is not a place you are given, it is a place you fight for. My 18th birthday was a Tuesday. It was not marked by cake or candles or a room full of people singing off key. It was marked by the crisp finality of a cardboard box. The box was standard issue, brown, anonymous, the same box they gave every kid who aged out of the system. I had watched a dozen of them leave with boxes just like mine, walking down that long linoleum hallway toward a door that only opened one way. Now it was my turn. The box contained everything I owned in this world. 3 changes of clothes, each one a size too small because the system does not keep up with growing bodies. A toothbrush with fraying bristles. A worn paperback copy of a novel I had read so many times the spine had turned to powder. And one photograph. That photograph was the most valuable thing I possessed. It showed a woman standing in a field somewhere, squinting into a sun I could not feel, smiling a smile I could barely remember. Her hair was red, not the dull auburn that some people call red, but the real thing. The color of October leaves just before they fall. It was blowing in a wind I would never know, across a face I had spent 10 years trying not to forget. They told me she was my mother. Her name was Siobhan Connolly Gallagher. And for 10 years, that single photograph had been the only proof I had that I came from somewhere, that someone once had loved me enough to smile. My name is Maeve Gallagher. I was 8 years old when my mother died. I was 18 years old when the state of Connecticut decided I was no longer its problem. And for every single day in between, I lived inside the walls of St. Augustine's Home for Children in Bridgeport, Connecticut, carrying a cardboard box that got heavier every year, even though nothing was ever added to it. That box was my entire biography, my birth certificate, my severance package, my goodbye. But I was not alone in my impermanence. I had something more precious than any photograph, something the system could not file away or transfer or lose in a drawer. I had my brother. Kieran was 15 years old, 3 years younger than me, 3 years further from freedom. He had the same dark hair as our mother, the kind that caught the light and turned almost blue in the winter. The state insurance covered it while he was in the system. The state insurance was generous like that right up until the moment it was not. I was leaving the system today, and Kieran had 2 weeks of medication left. Mr. Hargrove, the facility director, called me into his office at precisely 9 in the morning. The office always smelled the same way. Stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a scent I had come to associate with bad news and paperwork and the quiet violence of bureaucracy. Hargrove was a man whose face seemed permanently arranged in an expression of mild inconvenience, as if the children in his care were a series of forms that had been filled out incorrectly. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. The pleather was cracked and cold, even through my jeans. "Well, Maeve," he began, steepling his fingers the way he always did when he was about to deliver information he considered administrative rather than personal. "Today is the day, 18, a legal adult." He said it with the enthusiasm of a man announcing a change in the cafeteria schedule. "The state's responsibility for your welfare officially concludes at 5 p.m. I nodded. I had been counting down to this day for years. Every foster kid does. You dream about it the way a prisoner dreams about the gate. But now that it was here, the dream had turned inside out. Freedom, it turned out, felt a lot like being pushed off a cliff in the dark. "There is one other matter," Mr. Hargrove said. Something in his voice made me look up. "Your brother." My heart stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The way a clock stops when the battery dies. One moment there is time, and the next there is only silence. "Kieran is not your responsibility," Hargrove continued. "Legally speaking, he has 3 years remaining in the system. And given your current lack of stable housing, employment, or financial resources, the state cannot recommend." "What are you saying?" The words came out cracked, broken in half. "I am saying that Kieran will, by my numbers, transferred to a specialized facility in Maine. They have a program there for children with chronic medical needs. It is a good program, well-funded. He will receive excellent care. Maine, 8 hours away, a different state, a different world." "You cannot do that," I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it filled the room like a scream. "He is my brother. He is all I have." Hargrove's expression did not change. It never changed. That was perhaps the cruelest thing about him. Not that he was unkind, but that he was indifferent. Cruelty requires effort. Indifference is just gravity. The decision has been made. The transfer is scheduled for Friday. 3 days. I had 3 days before they would take the only family I had left and scatter us like ashes in the wind. 3 days before Kieran would wake up in a strange bed, surrounded by strange faces in a strange state, knowing that his sister had failed to protect him. 3 days before the last thread connecting me to anything real would be cut by a pair of bureaucratic scissors. I walked out of that office with my cardboard box and my breaking heart. I walked down the long linoleum hallway one final time, past the bulletin board, with its faded motivational posters, past the cafeteria where I had eaten 10,000 meals, that all tasted the same, past the common room where Kieran and I used to sit together on the old couch reading to each other, because it was the only way to make the walls feel less close. The automatic door hissed shut behind me. For the first time in 10 years, there was no one on the other side waiting for me. No one watching me go. No one counting the days until I came back. Because I was never coming back. I sat on the front steps of St. Augustine's, staring at nothing, the cardboard box on my lap, like a coffin for a life that had never really lived. The March air was raw and gray. A fine drizzle misted down, the kind of rain that does not fall so much as hang in the air, turning everything damp and cold and hopeless. That was when my phone buzzed. The phone was state-issued. Cheap. Prepaid. 200 minutes of talk time and a crack across the screen that split the display into two jagged halves, like a face trying to become two people. I did not recognize the number. I almost did not answer. Is this Maeve Gallagher? The voice was female, sharp, efficient, the kind of voice that filed its words in alphabetical order before letting them out. Yes. My name is Elaine Whitmore. I am an attorney. I need to speak with you regarding a matter of inheritance. I almost laughed. The sound caught in my throat like a bone. Inheritance. The word was so foreign, so absurd in the context of my life that it felt like a cruel joke. Orphans, like me, do not inherit things. We do not have family trees. We have stumps. We have cardboard boxes and 200 minutes of prepaid talk time and a photograph of a woman we can barely remember. I think you have the wrong person. Maeve Catherine Gallagher. On March 15th, 2007, Mother Siobhan Connolly Gallagher, deceased. The sound of my mother's name stopped my breath. No one said her name. No one in the system ever said her name. She was a case number, a file, a date of death. She was not a name. She was not a person who had once baked apple pies on Sundays and sung songs in a language I did not understand and held me so close I could hear her heart beating through her chest. But this woman had said her name, and it was like hearing a door open in a room I thought had been sealed forever. How do you know that name? Ms. Gallagher. I was the attorney for your maternal grandfather, Ronan Connolly. He passed away 5 years ago, but his will was complicated. It stipulated that his estate not be transferred until you reach the age of 18. Grandfather, the word landed in my mind like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples in every direction. I had no grandfather. I had no family at all except Kieran. That was what they had always told us. Our mother died in a car accident when I was 8 and Kieran was 5. Our father was unknown, a blank space on a birth certificate, a question mark that had never resolved into an answer. We had no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no grandparents. That was the story. That was what the paperwork said. I do not have a grandfather. You did, Elaine Whitmore said. Her voice softened by exactly 1 degree, which for a woman like her was the equivalent of a bear hug. And he left you something, you and your brother both. She paused. There is also the matter of guardianship. If you are willing to accept the inheritance and the responsibility that comes with it, you could petition to become Kieran's legal guardian. The court would look favorably on someone with property and assets. He would not have to be transferred. My hand tightened on the phone until the cracked screen pressed into my palm hard enough to leave a mark. What do I have to do, Tuan? Come to my office today if possible. I will explain everything. She gave me an address in downtown Hartford. I wrote it on my hand with a pen that was almost out of ink, pressing hard to make the letters stick. And when I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long time staring at the address, bleeding blue into the lines of my palm. A grandfather I never knew existed. An inheritance I could not imagine. And a chance maybe to keep my brother. Elaine Whitmore's office was in an old brick building, squeezed between a vape shop and a bail bondsman on a street in Hartford that had seen better decades. The kind of place that announced its legitimacy with a brass plaque so tarnished you could not read the name without squinting. The stairwell smelled of old paper and dust, a scent that was somehow more comforting than the chemical sterility I had breathed for 10 years. The lawyer herself was a woman who seemed to have been constructed entirely from sharp practical angles. Her gray hair was cut in a severe bob. Her glasses were thick enough to magnify her eyes into something that missed nothing and forgave less. She did not offer platitudes or sympathy. She did not ask me how I was doing, or whether I needed anything, or any of the hollow things that adults say to orphans to make themselves feel better. She offered me a seat in a lukewarm cup of tea in a chipped ceramic mug. I appreciated her for that more than she would ever know. Maeve, she said, her voice raspy but firm, like a road that had been traveled hard but still held. I was your grandfather's attorney for many years. Ronan Connolly was a client of mine, and in some ways a friend, a very private man. She opened a thick string-bound file on her desk. The paper inside was yellowed with age, the edges soft. Your grandfather owned a parcel of land in Montana, 8 acres in the Bitterroot Mountains, in a county most people have never heard of. He died 5 years ago, but his will was explicit. The deed was not to be transferred until you turned 18. He wanted you to be an adult free of the state's influence before you had to make any decisions. What decisions? Well, she said, tapping a long, unpainted nail on a sheaf of documents. There is the matter of the property itself. It is remote, undeveloped. According to the county assessor, it contains a small cabin in a state of significant disrepair. She paused. And then there are the back taxes. She named a figure that made my cardboard box feel like a mansion. It was an impossible sum. More money than I had ever touched. More money than I could earn in a year of working every job I was qualified for, which was approximately none. You have 90 days to settle the arrears, or the county will seize the property and sell it at auction. A familiar coldness washed over me. The system again. Always a deadline, always a debt. Always someone telling you that the gift comes with strings and the strings come with knots, and the knots come with a clock ticking down to the moment when everything you thought was yours gets taken away. I had been given an inheritance only to be told I could not afford it. So I inherit a debt, I said. The bitterness was sharp enough to taste. Not exactly. Elaine slid a glossy brochure across the desk. The logo at the top read Summit Ridge Corporation in sleek silver lettering, the kind of font that costs money to design. Beneath it was an aerial photograph of mountains so beautiful they looked like a lie. Summit Ridge has been trying to acquire land in that area for a new ski resort and luxury development project. Your grandfather's parcel is one of the last holdouts. They are aware of the tax situation. She turned the brochure around. They have made an offer. There was a number on the page. I stared at it. It was enough to pay the taxes 10 times over. It was enough to rent an apartment, buy a car, fill a refrigerator, and pay for Kieran's medication for years. It was enough to buy a life, a real life, the kind of life I had only ever seen through windows from the outside, pressing my face against the glass. My mind struggled to hold the number. Yesterday I had $300 in a cardboard box. Today I was looking at a figure that could change everything. You could be a very comfortable young woman, Maeve, Elaine said quietly. Your grandfather was eccentric. I am not entirely sure what he expected you to do with a piece of remote, undeveloped land in the middle of the Montana wilderness. My professional advice, and I say this as someone who cared about Ronan, is to sign the papers, take the money, and start your life. She folded her hands on the desk. Forget this ever happened. It was the smart play. It was the only play. Any rational person, any person who had grown up the way I had, hungry for stability, desperate for safety, would have signed those papers before the ink in Elaine Whitmore's pen had time to dry. But something held me back. It was not logic. It was not strategy. It was the smallest word in the document, a word that had snagged in my mind like a fishhook and would not let go. The deed mentioned something else, I said, remembering her earlier description. Something about a cave. Elaine frowned, flipping through the yellowed pages. Ah, yes, here it is. The language is very specific. She read from the document, her voice flat and precise. The aforementioned parcel of land, including the primary cabin structure and the adjoined sealed cave structure. She looked up at me over the rim of her thick glasses. It is odd, I will admit. There is no geological survey on file that indicates any significant cave systems in that immediate region. I asked the Summit Ridge representative about it. They conducted an aerial survey and found nothing but a rock outcropping near the cabin. They assume it was a root cellar of some kind that collapsed years ago. They consider it a non-factor. A sealed cave structure. Why would you seal a root cellar? Why would you mention it specifically in a legal document? Why would a man who had been so careful, so deliberate about every other detail in his will, bother to include a collapsed hole in the ground? on my grandfather. The man I could not remember. The man whose existence had been hidden from me for my entire life. He had not just left me a piece of land. He had left me a question. What about guardianship? I asked. You said I could become Kieran's guardian. If you accept the inheritance, the court would look favorably on your petition. You would have property, assets, stability. It would not be automatic, but it would be possible. Property, assets, stability. Or I could sign the papers, take the money right now today, and guarantee Kieran's safety immediately. Pay for his medication. Rent an apartment. Build a life. But I would never know why a man I had never met had sealed a cave and waited 5 years beyond his own death to tell me about it. I want to see it, I said. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise her. They came from somewhere deeper than thought, from the same place that had kept me counting Kieran's breaths every night for 10 years. From the place that still remembered the smell of cinnamon and butter on a Sunday afternoon. Before I sign anything, I want to see the land. Elaine sighed. It was a long, weary exhalation, the sound of a woman who had been practicing law for too many years to be surprised by anything, but who could still occasionally be disappointed. She looked at me. There was a flicker of something in her sharp eyes. Pity, perhaps, or maybe something rarer. Maybe it was respect. The disbursement from the state will not be enough for a round trip. Then I will buy a one-way ticket. The silence that followed was heavy, but I could feel something in it. Something that felt like solid ground after a lifetime of floating. This might be the stupidest decision I had ever made. It might be the decision that cost me everything, including my brother. But it would be mine. The first decision of my life that belonged entirely to me. If you were standing where I was standing at that crossroads, what would you have chosen? The guaranteed money that could secure your brother's future right now today? No risk, no mystery, no questions. Or the sealed cave left by a grandfather you never knew existed on a mountain, you had never seen in a state you could not find on a map. I think this is a question we all face at some point. Not the same crossroads, not the same stakes, but that same impossible choice between the safe thing and the thing that might actually mean something. That night I called Kieran. He answered on the first ring. He always answered on the first ring when I called. His voice was thin, reedy, the way it always sounded when the cold air had been working on his lungs all day, and he was trying not to cough because he did not want me to worry. They told me, he said before I could speak, about Maine. I know. I know you know. I could hear it in the way the phone rang. You let it ring twice instead of once. You only do that when something is wrong. He was 15 years old. He could not always breathe, but he noticed everything. Kieran listened to me. Something happened today. Something that might change everything. I told him about the phone call, about the grandfather we never knew, about the land in Montana and the sealed cave, and the impossible choice between money that could save us and a mystery that might destroy us. I told him about Elaine Whitmore and her chipped ceramic mug and the number on the glossy brochure that was large enough to buy us a real life. When I finished, there was silence on the line. The kind of silence that has weight. Maeve, Kieran said finally, I want to come with you. What no, Kieran? Your lungs, the altitude. Montana is mountains. You can barely breathe at sea level when it gets cold. I do not care. His voice cracked. I heard him fighting a cough, fighting to keep the words steady, fighting the way he had been fighting his whole life just to do the thing that every other person does without thinking. This is our family, May, the only family we have left. If there are answers in that cave, I want to see them too. I want to know who we are, where we come from. I have spent my whole life being the sick kid, the one who has to stay behind, the one who cannot do anything dangerous or exciting or real. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice was different, steadier, older than 15. If I have to go to Maine, I want to go knowing the truth first. I want to go knowing that we tried. I closed my eyes. He was 15 years old. He was fragile in ways that kept me awake at night. He was the only person in this world who shared my blood, and he was right. Okay, I said. Okay, we go together. The next morning, I went back to St. Augustine's. I walked through that automatic door one more time, and I signed the papers for emergency provisional guardianship, citing the inheritance and the pending estate matters as evidence of my ability to provide. Mr. Hargrove looked at me like I had lost my mind. His expression suggested that this was an irregularity, and irregularities were the thing he disliked most in a world he had carefully organized into procedures and protocols. Maybe I had lost my mind. Maybe this was the kind of decision you could only make when you had nothing left to lose. But by noon, I had Kieran beside me, his inhaler in his pocket, his backpack on his thin shoulders, his dark hair falling into his eyes the way it always did, the way our mother's hair must have fallen before she learned to pin it back. We stood at the bus station in downtown Bridgeport, two kids with backpacks and nothing else staring up at the departure board like it was written in a foreign language. Two and one-way tickets to Copper Creek, Montana. $300 from the state of Connecticut, which had decided that $300 was the approximate value of 18 years of responsibility. 2 weeks of Kieran's medication sealed in a Ziploc bag that I kept in the inside pocket of my jacket close to my body because it was the most expensive thing either of us had ever carried. And a single photograph of a woman with red hair and a smile that I was beginning to suspect had been hiding something terrible. Kieran looked at me as the bus pulled up to the curb, belching diesel exhaust into the cold morning air. "You sure about this?" "No," I said. "Not even a little." He grinned. That quick, bright grin that broke through his worry like a match struck in a dark room. "Good," he said, "because if you were sure, I would know you were lying." We climbed aboard. We found two seats near the back. We watched Bridgeport shrink in the rearview window until it was just a gray smudge on the horizon, and then it was gone, and there was nothing ahead of us but highway and mountains and whatever was waiting inside a sealed vault on the other side of the country. We were going to find out who we were, or we were going to lose everything trying. The bus ride west was a journey into another world. It began in the familiar gray labyrinth of the Northeast, the windows reflecting an endless blur of concrete and highway guardrails and fast food signs. Kieran sat beside me with his head against the guise, watching the landscape change with the quiet concentration of someone memorizing a foreign alphabet. The houses grew farther apart. The roads narrowed. Billboards disappeared. The sky, which had been a perpetual smear of smoggy white over Connecticut, deepened by slow degrees into a hard crystalline blue that seemed to go on forever. By the second day we were climbing, the engine of the old Greyhound groaned in protest as it wound its way through forests of pine and birch so thick they blocked out the sun. Patches of old, stubborn snow clung to the shadows of north-facing slopes. The air that hissed through the vents grew colder, sharper, thinner. Kieran's breathing grew more labored as we climbed. I watched him from the corner of my eye, counting the seconds between each inhale. It is a habit I developed years ago, a kind of private mathematics that I perform constantly without thinking, the way a mother counts the beats of a newborn's pulse. 4 seconds between breaths is normal. 5 is concerning. 6 means reach for the inhaler. He caught me watching. He rolled his eyes. "I am fine, May." I did not say anything. "You are counting again. I can always tell because your lips move." He smiled, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked so much like the photograph of our mother that my chest ached with a pain I could not name. It was not sadness exactly. It was more like homesickness for a home I had never actually had. "Tell me about her," he said softly. "What do you remember?" I had been dreading this question for 10 years. Not because I did not want to answer it, but because the answer was so small, so inadequate. 8 years of a mother reduced to fragments, like a plate that has been dropped and then swept up, leaving only a few pieces large enough to hold. "I remember the smell of apple pie," I said slowly. "She used to bake it on Sundays. The whole apartment would fill up with the smell of cinnamon and butter and baked apples, and it would last for hours. It was the best smell in the world. I have never smelled anything like it since." "What else?" "Her voice. She used to sing to us at bedtime, old songs, Irish songs, I think. I did not understand the words, but they made me feel safe, like nothing bad could happen as long as she was singing." Kieran was quiet for a long moment. The bus rumbled through a tunnel of trees, and the light inside went green and gold. "I do not remember anything," he said. "I was too young. All I have is the photograph. That is enough. She is in you, Kieran, every time you smile, every time you laugh at something stupid, every time you roll your eyes at me when I am counting your breaths. I see her." He looked away, but not before I saw his eyes shining. "There is one more thing," I said. "Something I have never told you." He turned back, waiting. The night before the accident, Mom pulled me aside after dinner. She kneeled down so she was looking right at me, right into my eyes, and she took my hands and she held them tight. And she said, "Maeve, if anything ever happens, if strangers ever come asking questions, do not trust them. Do not trust anyone they send." Kieran frowned. "What does that mean?" "I do not know. I was 8. I did not understand then, and I still do not understand now. But I have never forgotten the way she looked when she said it." I paused. "She was scared, Kieran. Not nervous, not worried, scared. The kind of scared where you can see the whites of someone's eyes." The bus rumbled on through the mountains. The sky darkened. Snow began to fall outside the window light and crystalline, catching the last of the fading light. And I wondered not for the first time what our mother had been running from. The bus wheezed to a stop in Copper Creek as the sun was setting, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and violet so vivid they looked painted on. The air was so cold it felt sharp like breathing broken glass. I watched Kieran carefully as he stepped off the bus, but he seemed to be handling the altitude better than I had feared. His breathing was tight but steady. His color was good. We were the only passengers who got off. The bus pulled away its red taillights, shrinking down the empty road until they winked out entirely, and then there was nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence I had never experienced in my life. Not the dead silence of an empty room. The living silence of a place so vast and so indifferent to human existence that the concept of noise had simply never occurred to it. Copper Creek was barely a town. A single main street with a general store, a diner with a neon sign missing half its letters, a bar called the Ridgeline, with a wooden porch and two rocking chairs out front and not much else. The mountains rose up on all sides, massive and ancient, and utterly unconcerned with two kids from Connecticut standing in the middle of the road with backpacks and fading hope. "Now what?" Kieran asked. Before I could answer, a voice called out from across the street. "You the Gallagher kids." We turned. An old man was walking toward us. He moved slowly with the careful, deliberate gait of someone whose joints had earned every ache through decades of hard use. His face was weathered to the color and texture of an old saddle, and his eyes were sharp and beneath the brim of a battered canvas cap. He was tall, even stooped by age, and his hands were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, with the white lines of old cuts and healed fractures. "I am Judson Embry," he said. "Folks call me Judd. I run the closest thing to a taxi service this valley has got, which is to say I own a truck and I have got nothing better to do." He looked us up and down, taking in our thin jackets and our city shoes, and the way we were hugging ourselves against the cold. Elaine Whitmore called ahead. "Said you would be coming." He paused, his eyes changed. Something moved behind them, something that looked like memory. "Said you are Ronan Connolly's grandchildren." The name hung in the cold air between us like breath. "You knew him?" I asked. Judd let out a dry, crackling laugh. It sounded like gravel shifting in a tin can. "Knew him. I was his only friend in this whole valley for close to 20 years. Only person he trusted enough to share a bottle of whiskey with on a winter night. Only person he let pass the tree line." He gestured toward a rust-spotted station wagon parked at the curb. It was old enough to be in a museum and stubborn enough to still be running. "Come on, I will take you up to the property. But I have got to warn you, it is rough. Road is not plowed this time of year. Cabin has been sitting empty since Ronan passed. And some folks around here, they say that place is cursed." "Cursed?" Kieran asked. His eyes were wide. Judd shrugged. "People talk. Small town, big mountains, not enough to do. Ronan kept to himself. Never came down to town unless he had to. Never explained where he came from or why he was living up on that mountain alone, like a man hiding from God." He opened the back door of the station wagon. The interior smelled like pine sap and old coffee and dog hair, though there was no dog in sight. Some folks figured he was running from the law. Others figured he was just touched in the head. Lonely old man on a mountain talking to himself. He paused. His voice dropped. "But I will tell you one thing. He had pictures of you two in his wallet. Showed them to me once late at night after he had had a few drinks. Only time I ever saw that man close to tears." My throat tightened. "He said you were the only thing in the world that mattered to him. Said everything he did, everything he built up there was for you." "He knew about us," Kieran said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a boy discovering a continent he had been told did not exist. "Knew about you, son. Watched you from afar your whole lives. Sent money when he could, though I do not expect you ever saw a dime of it. The system eats things like that. Letters, too. He wrote letters." Judd shook his head. "Never knew if they arrived. Figured they did not. But he kept writing them anyway. Every birthday, every Christmas, every single one." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was lower, rougher, like a man trying to talk around something caught in his throat. I asked him once why he kept writing if he never got an answer. You know what he said? He said it did not matter if the letters arrived. What mattered was that he wrote them. That somewhere in the world, even if they never knew it, his grandchildren had a grandfather who sat down every year and put pen to paper and told them he loved them. He said the writing was the prayer. The mailbox was just a direction to point it. Judd cleared his throat. "I have lived a long time, seen a lot of men carry a lot of different kinds of weight, but I never saw a man carry anything heavier than what Ronan carried. And I never saw a man carry it quieter. He looked at me. He never forgot you. Not for one single day. The drive up the mountain took nearly an hour. The road, if you could call it that, was little more than a dirt track, rutted and treacherous climbing through forests so dense they swallowed the headlights whole. Judd drove in silence, his scarred hands steady on the wheel, and Kieran and I stared out at the wilderness pressing in on all sides like a living wall. The trees were enormous, ponderosa pines as thick as barrels, their bark split into plates the color of cinnamon. Douglas firs so tall their tops vanished into the darkness above the headlights' reach, and between them nothing. No houses, no power lines, no evidence of human existence at all. We had left the world behind. Finally, the headlights caught a break in the trees, a clearing. "There it is," Judd said quietly, "the Connolly place." I saw the cabin first. It was small, barely more than a shack really, with a sagging porch and a sharply pitched roof that was missing several shingles. The windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at the encroaching forest. It looked abandoned, defeated, like a man who had stopped fighting a long time ago. But as we drew closer, the headlights revealed something else. The stone chimney was straight and solid, mortared with care. The log walls were thick and square, fitted together with a precision that spoke of patience and skill. This cabin had been built to last by someone who knew what they were doing. It had been neglected, yes, but it had not been defeated. It was waiting. And then I saw it. To the left of the cabin, a sheer cliff of granite rose up 20 feet or more, its face smooth and pale in the headlights. And there at its base, set directly into the living rock, was something that made every hair on my body stand on end. A door. A heavy industrial steel door, approximately 6 feet by 6 feet, its surface a patchwork of rust and time. It was square and brutal and completely utterly wrong. It did not belong here. It did not belong on a mountainside in Montana. It belonged in a bank or a military installation or a bunker built to survive the end of the world. But what stopped my heart was not the door itself. It was the edges. They were not merely closed. They were sealed. A thick, ugly bead of weld ran along all four sides, bonding the steel to the rock with a permanence that spoke of intention, of finality, of a man who wanted to make absolutely certain that whatever was behind that door stayed behind that door. And in the center, a lock, the size of a fist, a complex circular mechanism unlike anything I had ever seen, with symbols etched faintly around its circumference that caught the headlights and glinted like a code. It was not a root cellar. It was not a collapsed hole in the ground. It was a vault. "What the hell is that?" Kieran whispered. Judd cut the engine. In the sudden silence, the only sound was the wind moaning through the pine trees, a low, mournful note that seemed to come from the mountain itself. "That," he said quietly, "is what your grandfather spent the last years of his life protecting." He turned in his seat and looked at us. His pale eyes were steady and serious. "And as far as I know, you two are the only ones who have a key. That first night in the cabin was the longest of my life. Judd helped us get a fire going in the old pot-bellied stove before he left. The iron was cold to the touch, and the first few attempts produced nothing but smoke that filled the cabin and made Kieran cough so hard I nearly called the whole thing off. But Judd was patient. He showed me how to build the fire from the bottom up, starting with thin strips of birch bark and working up to the split logs stacked beside the stove, and eventually a fragile orange flame took hold and began to push back the cold. He left us with a promise to return in the morning with supplies. The cabin was exactly what you would expect from a man who had whittled his entire existence down to the barest essentials. A simple bed frame in one corner, its mattress stripped to bare ticking. A single wooden chair pulled up to a rough-hewn table. A small pantry with a few rusted cans whose labels had long since peeled away. A kerosene lantern with a cracked chimney. No electricity, no running water. No evidence that this had ever been anything more than a shelter against the elements and a place to be alone. But it was ours. For the first time in our lives, we were inside walls that belonged to us. I searched while Kieran rested. His breathing was labored from the altitude and the cold, and I made him lie down on the bare mattress with every blanket we could find, which amounted to 2 moth-eaten wool blankets that smelled like cedar and thyme. He protested. He always protested. But I could hear the wheeze in his lungs, and I was not going to lose him to stubbornness. I searched every corner of that cabin. Every cupboard, every shelf. I pulled out drawers and checked behind them. I ran my hands along the floorboards, feeling for loose ones. I searched the way you search when you know there is something to find, but you do not know what it looks like. And just when I was about to give up, my flashlight beam caught something beneath the bed frame. A footlocker. It was heavy, military green, secured with 2 sturdy latches that had been oiled recently enough that they were not rusted shut. Recently enough, 5 years after his death. I dragged it out, my heart hammering in my chest so loud I was certain Kieran could hear it. The latches were not locked. They sprang open with a sharp, satisfying click that echoed in the small cabin like a gunshot. Inside, I found tools, a heavy-duty angle grinder with a fresh cutting wheel still in its packaging, a small gasoline-powered generator compact and portable, thick leather work gloves, safety goggles, and beside them nested in a cloth pouch a bundle of strange keys held together on a steel ring. They were forged from dark heavy metal and their teeth were not the jagged ridges of a normal key. They were circular, complex, teeth designed for a lock I had already seen, the lock on the steel door. But it was the envelope that made me stop breathing. It was tucked into the corner of the footlocker, yellowed with age, the corners soft with handling. And written on the front, in a shaky but clear hand, were two words, Maeve and Kieran. He knew our names. This was not an accident. This was not a random bequest in a dusty will. This was a message sent across time from a dead man to the grandchildren he had never been allowed to hold. He had packed these tools. He had written this envelope. He had placed them here beneath this bed in this cabin, knowing that one day we would come, knowing that one day we would stand in this room and wonder what was behind that steel door. And he had given us the means to find out. My hands trembled as I tore open the seal. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, shaky but deliberate, each word chosen with the care of a man who knew these might be the most important words he ever wrote. The message was short. Maeve and Kieran. The grinder is for the welds. The keys are for the lock. It will be loud. No one will hear you. What you find inside is your choice, not your burden. You can walk away. You can take the money they have offered and never look back. I hope you can forgive me. Ronan, I read the note 3 times. Your choice, not your burden. He was giving us an out. He was telling us we could take the developer's money and disappear. Live comfortable lives, never look back, never know. But he had also packed the grinder. He had also left the keys. He had also sealed that door and waited 5 years beyond his own grave to hand us the tools to open it. He wanted us to choose. But he had made damn sure we had every reason to choose the harder path. Forgive him for what? For abandoning us, for leaving us to the system, for watching from afar, while we grew up alone in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken promises. Or for something else entirely. I looked at Kieran. He was asleep on the bare mattress, his breathing shallow but steady, his face slack and young in the firelight. He looked like a child. He was a child. My child in every way that mattered, because no one else in this world had ever stepped up to claim the job. I looked at the steel door, visible through the cabin's grimy window. It caught the moonlight and held it a rectangle of dull silver against the dark rock. I looked at the note in my hand, and I made my choice. Tomorrow I was going to open that door. Tomorrow I was going to find out what our grandfather had spent the last years of his life protecting. Tomorrow I was going to find out who we really were. And whatever was behind that steel door, whatever truth or horror or impossible revelation was waiting in the dark, I was going to face it. Not because I was brave, not because I was sure, but because I had spent 18 years not knowing, and the not knowing had become heavier than anything the truth could possibly be. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind moaned in the pines. Kieran breathed in and out 4 seconds between each inhale. I pulled the photograph of our mother from my jacket pocket. In the firelight, her red hair seemed to glow. Her smile, which I had always read as happiness, looked different now. There was something behind it, a shadow, a warning. The same expression she had worn that last night when she gripped my hands and told me not to trust anyone they send. She had known something. She had been afraid of something. And she had died before she could tell me what it was. I pressed the photograph against my chest and closed my eyes. I'm going to find out, I whispered. I promise you, I'm going to find out what happened. And somewhere behind 6 feet of welded steel buried in the belly of a mountain, a dead man's secret waited for morning. The work was brutal. I woke before dawn while Kieran was still sleeping, his breath a thin whistle in the cold air. The fire in the pot-bellied stove had burned down to a bed of gray ash with a few orange embers glowing at the center like dying stars. I fed it carefully the way Judd had shown me, building it back up from birch bark and kindling until the flame caught and the small cabin began to warm. Then I pulled on the leather work gloves. I put on the safety goggles. I dragged the small generator out into the snow. The morning was still dark. The sky above the tree line was the color of a bruised purple and black and edged with the faintest line of cold gray light along the eastern ridge. The air was so cold it burned my nostrils. My boots crunched through a crust of ice that had formed overnight, and each step sent a sharp crack echoing through the silent forest. I had never used a power tool in my life. I had never built anything with my hands. In 18 years on this earth, the closest I had come to manual labor was scrubbing cafeteria floors at St. Augustine's with a mop that was older than I was. I did not know how to read a level. I did not know the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead. I did not know how to start a generator, but I knew how to figure things out. That is what the system teaches you if it teaches you anything at all. Not skills, not knowledge, just the raw, desperate ability to look at a problem and find a way through it because no one is coming to help you and the clock is always ticking. I found the pull cord on the generator. I braced my feet. I pulled. Nothing. I pulled again. Harder. My shoulders screamed in protest. Nothing. On the fifth pull, something inside the machine caught. A cough, a sputter, and then a roar that shattered the mountain's sacred silence like a hammer through a cathedral window. The sound was obscene in that wilderness. An assault on the peace. A declaration of war against the quiet. No one will hear you. Ronan had known. He had planned for this. He had spent years on this mountain mapping every detail, calculating every variable, building a path for us to follow like a trail of breadcrumbs through a forest he knew we would have to cross in the dark. I picked up the angle grinder. The cutting wheel was new, still sharp, its edge catching the first gray light of dawn. I pressed the trigger. The wheel screamed to life, spinning so fast it became a blur, and the sound it made was a high, thin shriek that set my teeth on edge. I brought it to the first weld. The moment the cutting wheel touched the bead of welded steel, the world exploded into light. A torrent of brilliant orange sparks erupted from the point of contact, cascading down the rock face like a waterfall of fire. The smell of hot metal filled the air, sharp and acrid, burning the inside of my nose. The vibration traveled up through my hands, through my wrists, through my arms and shoulders, and into my spine. It rattled my bones. It shook my teeth. It felt like holding onto the tail of something alive and furious and barely contained. It was terrifying. It was the most alive I had ever felt. Kieran appeared at the cabin door. He was wrapped in both wool blankets, his dark hair wild from sleep, his eyes wide in the half-light. "What are you doing?" "Opening it," I said without stopping. The sparks showered down around my boots. "Go back inside. Stay warm." But he did not go back inside. He sat down on the porch. He pulled the blankets tight around his thin shoulders. And he watched. His breath plumed white in the freezing air, and every few minutes I heard him cough a sound that made my stomach clench with worry. But he did not leave. He did not go back to the warmth. He wanted to see. He wanted to know the truth as badly as I did. The first weld took over an hour. The steel was thick, the bead ugly and uneven, laid down by someone who was more concerned with permanence than aesthetics. I had to work the grinder back and forth, finding the angle, adjusting the pressure, learning through failure, what no one had ever taught me through instruction. My arms began to ache within the first 20 minutes. By the end of the first hour, they were trembling. But the weld gave way. The first cut was complete. A line of raw, bright metal where the seal had been like a wound in the steel. The second weld went faster. I was learning, finding the rhythm, understanding the way the tool wanted to move, the angle at which it cut cleanest, the pressure that was firm enough to bite but not so hard that the wheel bound up and kicked back. The sun rose as I started the third weld. Pale winter light spilled over the ridge and flooded the clearing, turning the snow from gray to blinding white. The shadows retreated into the tree line, and the steel door, which had looked so ominous in the dark, now looked almost ordinary in the daylight. Just a rectangle of rusted metal set into rock. Just a door. But I knew better. What was behind it was anything but ordinary. Halfway through the third weld, the generator sputtered. I knew the sound, the same ugly choking cough that a machine makes when its fuel runs dry. The grinder slowed, the sparks faded, and then silence. I wanted to scream. To come this far. To spend hours in the cold, my arms shaking, my face grimy with sweat and metal dust, my ears ringing from the noise. To be this close with only one weld remaining, and to be defeated by an empty fuel tank. But then I remembered. The cabin. The pantry. Ronan had thought of the tools. He had thought of the generator. He had thought of the keys. He had thought of everything. I stumbled back inside on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. I searched the small pantry, pushing aside a stack of rotted firewood that had been piled in the corner. And there behind the wood, right where a man who had planned everything would have put it, was a single red gasoline can. Almost full. He had thought of everything. I carried the can back outside. My hands were so stiff from the cold and the vibration that I could barely unscrew the cap. But I managed. I refueled the generator. I pulled the cord. It caught on the second try this time, as if the machine had decided we were on the same side. The fourth and final weld was the hardest. It ran along the bottom edge of the door close to the ground, and I had to kneel in the snow to reach it. The cold soaked through my jeans, immediately numbing my knees, but I did not care. I pressed the grinder to the steel, and I cut. The sparks fell onto the snow and hissed and died. The vibration rattled my skeleton. And then with a final shower of orange fire, the last weld gave way. The door was free. I shut off the generator. The silence that returned was different from the silence before. It was not the silence of a place at rest. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of a held breath. The mountain itself seemed to be waiting. I took the heavy ring of keys from my pocket. My fingers were clumsy with cold and exhaustion, and I nearly dropped them in the snow. I studied the face of the lock. Its circular design was unlike anything I had encountered. The symbols etched around its circumference were faint-worn by weather, but still legible. They were not letters. They were not numbers. They were something else, a language I did not speak. I tried the first key. It slid partway in and stopped. Wrong shape. The second key, nothing. Would not even enter the slot. The third, the fourth, and then I saw it. One key on the ring was different from the others. Slightly smaller, slightly darker, and at its base where the other keys had a simple bow, this one had a small circular plate stamped with markings that matched the symbols etched around the lock. I inserted this key. It slid in smoothly, perfectly, the way a hand slides into a glove that was made for it. I turned it. There was a moment of resistance, a catch, a tension deep inside the mechanism like a muscle about to release. And then with a deep resonant clunk that seemed to come from the very center of the mountain, the tumbler shifted. Another turn, a series of smaller clicks, precise and sequential, like the inner workings of a giant clock measuring out a final second. I held my breath. I pulled. The heavy steel door resisted for a moment, held fast by the vacuum of years, the seal of time itself holding the door closed. And then with a groan of tortured metal that echoed off the rock face and rolled away through the forest like distant thunder. It swung outward. Cold air rushed out. It carried with it the smell of concrete and age and something else. Something that smelled like old paper and oil, and the particular musty sweetness of things that have been sealed away from the world for a very long time. Secrets, that is what it smelled like. Secrets and patience and a dead man's hope. I stepped inside. It was not a cave. It was not a natural cavern carved by water and time. My flashlight beam swept across the interior and revealed a room that was perfectly square, approximately 20 feet deep. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of them were smooth, poured concrete, reinforced with steel rebar that was visible in places where the surface had cracked with age. It had been built, designed, engineered with a precision that turned a hollow in the rock into something permanent and purposeful. It was a bunker, and it was full. Lining the walls from floor to ceiling were heavy-duty metal shelving units, the industrial kind bolted to the concrete with lag screws. And on those shelves, packed tightly together with military precision, were dozens of identical footlockers. Each one was olive green, each one was closed, and each one was stenciled on its lid with a code. Letters and numbers arranged in a filing system that I could not yet decipher. A catalog of something, an archive. My eyes moved across the rows trying to count. 20, 30, maybe more. Each one containing something that a man had spent years collecting, organizing, and sealing away in a vault inside a mountain. But one locker drew my gaze immediately. It sat at eye level directly in front of me, on a shelf that had been left otherwise empty, as if the space around it was a frame. It had no code. Instead, stenciled in the same neat, careful lettering as the note in the cabin were two words, Maeve and Kieran. I lifted it down. It was heavier than the one that had contained the tools, heavier by a significant margin. I set it on the cold concrete floor. My hands shook as I unlatched the clasps. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was money. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. They were old. The design on the bills was not the current one. Benjamin Franklin's face stared up at me from another era grave, and knowing as if he had been waiting for this moment too. But they were real. Bundle after bundle after bundle, filling the bottom of the footlocker in neat, tight rows. I did not count them. I could not count them. My mind had stopped processing numbers the way a circuit breaker trips when the current exceeds what the wires can carry. It was a fortune, an impossible, life-altering, world-rearranging fortune. It made the developer's offer look like pocket change. Beneath the money was a large, leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age but its binding still tight. and beside the ledger, a thick stack of envelopes tied together with the same twine. The top envelope was larger than the others, heavier. It had our names on it. This was the real inheritance. Not the money was just paper. This was the answer. This was the thing our grandfather had spent the last years of his life building, organizing and sealing away in the dark. This was the truth he had been too broken to deliver in person and too stubborn to let die with him. I sat down on the cold concrete floor. The chill soaked through my jeans and into my bones, but I barely felt it. The smell of old money and aged paper and concrete filled my lungs. Kieran appeared in the doorway. His silhouette was dark against the bright morning light behind him, and for a moment he looked like a figure in a painting framed by the heavy steel threshold. "What is it?" he whispered. "I do not know yet," I said, "but I think we are about to find out." I picked up the thick envelope. I broke the seal. I unfolded the pages inside, and I began to read. The letter was long. Letter. The handwriting was steady and deliberate. The script of a man who had spent years choosing every word with the care of a surgeon selecting instruments. But beneath that steadiness, I could feel something else. A tremor. The weight of a confession that had been building pressure for decades, pressing against the walls of a man's chest like water behind a dam. My dearest granddaughters and grandsons. He had not known. When he wrote this letter, he did not know whether he would have granddaughters or grandsons or both. He had prepared for any possibility. The thought of this old man alone on a mountain writing a letter to grandchildren whose faces he would never see, whose voices he would never hear, broke something inside me. If you are reading this, then you are grown and you have made a choice I did not have the courage to make for you. I am sorry for the silence. I am sorry for the absence. I hope that by the time you finish this letter, you will not forgive me. I do not deserve forgiveness, but perhaps you will understand. I looked up at Kieran. He had come inside the vault, his blankets wrapped around his shoulders like a cloak, his breath shallow in the cold air. His face was pale. His eyes were enormous. He nodded for me to continue. My name was not always Ronan Connolly. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt them in my chest, in my stomach, in the base of my spine. The life I lived, the one that led me to this mountain and you to that orphanage, was built on a crime. My blood went cold. I looked at the footlocker full of cash. Hundreds of thousands of dollars wrapped in oilcloth and twine. It was not an inheritance, it was evidence. 40 years ago, in another city, in another life, I was a young man named Cormac Daly. I grew up in Boston, in the Irish neighborhood south of the city, where a man was measured by what he could do with his hands. I could drive. I was the best. I could make a car do things that physics said it should not do. I was talented, and I was young, and I was stupid. I fell in with the wrong people. A crew run by a man named Victor Stasek. They were professionals, cold, methodical. They planned jobs the way architects design buildings, every angle calculated, every variable accounted for. They were planning something big, a Federal Reserve currency transfer. Armored trucks moving newly printed bills between facilities. They needed a driver who could guarantee them a clean getaway through the streets of Boston at high speed, in any weather, in any conditions. They offered me a share that could set me up for the rest of my life. I took it. I stopped reading. My throat was dry. The concrete walls of the bunker seemed to press inward. Kieran's face was chalk white. "Keep going," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I need to know." The job went perfectly. Too perfectly. We were ghosts, no witnesses. No forensic evidence left behind. We walked away with over $5 million. My share was more than $800,000. I took my money. I changed my name to Ronan Connolly, and I ran. I went as far west as I could go without falling into the ocean. I ended up in Montana, in a valley where the mountains were so high that the rest of the world could not see over them. In a town where nobody asked questions because everybody had something they would rather not answer. And I met your grandmother. Eleanor was the best thing that ever happened to me. She did not know about the money or my past. She just knew me as Ronan, a quiet man who worked odd jobs and fixed engines and loved her without reservation, without condition, without the lies ever touching her. We married, we had a daughter, your mother Siobhan. My hands were shaking. The paper rattled against itself. I pressed it flat against my knee and kept reading. For 15 years I was happy. I was a husband and a father. I almost convinced myself that Cormac Daly was dead, that the man who had driven that car through the streets of Boston at 90 miles an hour with $5 million in the trunk was someone else entirely. A character in a story I had read a long time ago. But men like Victor Stasek do not forget. And money like that creates its own gravity. One of my former crew members got caught on an unrelated charge. Armed robbery. He was looking at 30 years and he started talking, trying to cut a deal, offering names, dates, details. Suddenly a cold case was hot again. And the people who came looking were not the police. They were Stasik's people. They did not want the money back. The money was nothing to Stasik. What they wanted was insurance. They wanted to ensure my permanent, absolute silence. They found me in Copper Creek. They did not threaten me directly. They were smarter than that. They came to the cabin. Two men in expensive coats who did not belong on a dirt road in Montana. They sat at my kitchen table and they drank my coffee and they showed me photographs. Photographs of your mother. Siobhan was 16 years old in those pictures, walking to school, sitting in a diner with friends, laughing. They told me that my new life was beautiful and that it would be a shame if anything happened to it. Kieran made a sound, a small, strangled noise in the back of his throat, the sound a person makes when the air is punched out of them. He slid down the concrete wall until he was sitting on the floor, his knees drawn up to his chest, the blankets pulling around him. I wanted to stop reading. I wanted to fold the letter up and put it back in the envelope and seal the vault and walk away and never come back. I wanted to take the money and the developer's offer and buy Kieran a life where none of this had ever happened. But I could not stop. The truth had its teeth in me now, and letting go was no longer an option. I was trapped. I had a choice. I could run again, but they would always find me. They had proved that. Or I could make another deal with the devil. Stasik had a rival, another organization moving in on his territory. He told me that if I used my old skills to help him eliminate the competition to deliver them to the federal authorities on a fabricated pretext, then he and my past would disappear forever. He swore on his family's name. He swore on his children's lives. He swore that my family would be safe. Like a fool, I believed him. I did what he asked. I helped orchestrate a fake transaction that led to a massive federal raid. Stasik's rivals were arrested. Their organization was dismantled. It worked. It worked perfectly. I thought I had finally bought my freedom. 1 week later, your mother went to a movie with her friends. She was 25 years old. She was wearing a blue dress. I know this because I saw her leave. I watched her walk to her car from the kitchen window, and I thought she looks just like her mother. There was an accident on the way home. A driver ran a red light. The impact was on the driver's side. She did not suffer, or so they told me. She was gone before the ambulance arrived. The words swam before my eyes. I could not see. The letter was shaking so badly that the words blurred and reformed and blurred again, and I realized that it was not the letter that was shaking. It was me. My entire body was trembling, a vibration that started somewhere deep in my chest and radiated outward through every muscle and bone and nerve. That was the official story. A tragic accident, a random event, a drunk driver who lost control and ran a red light and took a young mother away from her 2 children. But I knew it was not an accident. The driver was a man named Colin Moran. He was one of Stasik's operators, a professional. He walked away from the crash with a few bruises and a blood alcohol level that had been carefully manufactured to support the story. He received 2 years of probation. 2 years. For taking my daughter's life. It was a message. My debt was paid. The rivals were gone. But Stasik wanted me to understand something. He wanted me to know with absolute clarity that he owned my silence. That he could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. And that the system, the courts, the police, all of it would look the other way and call it a tragedy. They had murdered my daughter, and they had made it look like fate. I dropped the letter. A sound came out of me that I did not recognize. It was not a scream. It was not a cry. It was something more primitive than either. A raw, guttural noise that rose from the deepest part of my body and echoed off the concrete walls and filled the bunker with a grief so absolute that the air itself seemed to thicken. Our mother had not died in an accident. She had been murdered. And our grandfather, the man I had been prepared to hate for abandoning us, the man I had been prepared to forgive for watching us from afar, had been the cause. His choices, his crimes, his cowardice, his inability to say no to a job 40 years ago had created a chain of consequences that ended with a blue dress and a red light and 2 children who would spend the next decade wondering why the world had thrown them away. Kieran was crying. Silent tears ran down his face in steady streams, catching the flashlight beam and shining like scars. His body shook with sobs he would not release, trapping them inside his chest, where they fought against his damaged lungs. He clutched the photograph of our mother, pressing it to his heart with both hands, as if he could somehow push her image through his skin and carry her inside him, where she would be safe. They killed her, he whispered. They killed her and called it an accident, and we never knew. We spent 10 years in that place and nobody told us. Nobody ever told us the truth. I cried then. Not the quiet, choked-off sobs I had mastered in the dormitory at St. Augustine's, where you learn to cry without sound because sound invites attention and attention is never kind. I cried the way a person cries when the dam breaks, when the structure you have built to hold everything in place for years finally cracks under a weight it was never designed to carry. I cried for the mother I could barely remember, for the smell of apple pie and cinnamon on a Sunday afternoon, for the voice that sang songs in a language I did not understand, for the woman who had known something was wrong, who had told her 8-year-old daughter not to trust anyone they send, and who had died 1 week later because her father's past had finally caught up with her. I cried for the grandfather who had lived with this poison inside him for 5 years, on a mountain alone dying of guilt, building a vault full of evidence because it was the only atonement he could imagine. And I cried for us, for the 2 children who had believed the simple, clean lie because the truth was this monstrous, complicated thing that no child should ever have to carry. After a long time and the tears subsided, what replaced them was not peace. It was not acceptance. It was something colder, harder, a quiet, clear-eyed emptiness that felt like the calm at the center of a hurricane. I picked up the letter. There was more. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. Something inside me had shifted the way tectonic plates shift deep underground. A new landscape was forming. I did not yet know its shape, but I could feel the change. I could not go to the police. Who would believe me? A former felon and accomplice to a federal heist, accusing a powerful ghost-like figure of orchestrating a perfect murder disguised as a traffic accident. They would have put me in handcuffs before I finished the first sentence. And Stasik's people would have found you. You were all I had left of her, the last living pieces of my Siobhan. I knew in my soul that the only way to keep you safe was to disappear, to vanish so completely that I no longer existed, to let the world believe that Ronan Connolly was just a dead hermit on a mountain with nothing left behind, and to let the state take you. I know what that cost you. I know because it cost me everything. Every day for the rest of my life, I lived with the knowledge that my grandchildren were growing up alone because of my cowardice and my greed. Every birthday I imagined, every Christmas I missed, every night I lay in this cabin staring at the ceiling and wondering if you were warm, if you were safe, if you were loved, if anyone was singing to you the way your mother used to sing. And every morning I got up and I went to work. The letter continued. And now at last I understood. The vault, the footlockers, the filing system, the years of solitude, all of it. Stasik was meticulous. He kept records of everything. Not because he was careless, but because he was a businessman and businessmen keep ledgers, names, dates, account numbers, proof of bribes paid to judges and prosecutors, records of money laundered through shell companies, documentation of murders ordered, executed, and covered up. I spent the last 5 years of my life tracking it all down. Every day, every hour. Usually my old connections, the ones who owed me, the ones who were afraid of me, the ones who simply wanted out. I bought pieces of the puzzle from people who were too tired or too scared to hold on to them any longer. I built a case that no prosecutor could ignore. The other footlockers in this vault contain my life's work. Everything you need to destroy Victor Stasik and everyone who has ever worked for him: bank records, wire transfers, coded communications, photographs, sworn statements, and the name and current address of Colin Moran, the man who was driving the car that killed your mother. It is my confession, and it is their death sentence. I looked up from the letter. My eyes moved across the rows of footlockers, dozens of them stretching along the walls of the bunker in neat, ordered rows. Each one a chapter, each one a piece of a case that a broken old man had assembled alone on a mountain over 5 years, driven by guilt and grief and the furious, desperate hope that someone would finish what he had started. And so we come to the choice I have left you. It is a terrible choice, and I am a monster for placing it on your shoulders. But I could not make it for you. I tried. For 5 years, I tried to find the courage to take this evidence to the authorities myself. I could not do it. I was a coward in the beginning, and I was a coward at the end. In the footlocker with this letter is what remains of my share of the money from the heist. It is old now, untraceable. The serial numbers have long since cycled out of the system. You can take it and disappear. Live long, comfortable, happy lives. Never think of me or Victor Stasik or any of this again. No one would blame you. It is what I should have done 40 years ago. That is one path. The other path is in the other lockers. It is the path of justice. If you take that evidence to the right people, you can destroy Stasik and his entire organization. You can give your mother the justice she was denied. You can rewrite the official record. You can change the word accident to murder, but it will come at a cost. The money will have to be turned in. Your family name will be tied to a crime forever. And though Stasek is old and sick, his people are not. It will be dangerous. You will be trading a comfortable life for a righteous one. You will be trading money for truth. I do not know which you will choose. I only know that I could not choose for you. I live my life as a coward, hiding from the consequences of my own actions. My final hope is that I have raised grandchildren braver than I was. Whatever you decide, know that I loved your mother more than my own life, and I have loved you from afar in silence and shame every single day. Ronan Connolly, Cormac Daly. The letter fell from my fingers and drifted to the concrete floor. The weight of it pressed down on me. The bunker felt like a coffin. The walls pressed inward. The air was thick with the smell of money and paper and the residue of a man's entire ruined life. He had not left us an inheritance. He had left us a crucible, a test of who we were and who we wanted to become. On one side, a fortune in Titus and the freedom to be anyone we wanted anywhere in the world. On the other, a mountain of evidence and the chance to avenge a murder we had never known happened. The easy wrong or the harder right. And 48 hours to choose. The argument started at midnight. We were sitting in the cabin, the fire popping in the stove, the letter spread out on the rough-hewn table between us. Kieran had read it 3 times. His eyes were red. His breathing was ragged. Every few minutes he reached for his inhaler, took a pull, and set it back down with the careful precision of someone rationing a resource he knows is running out. "We have to do it," he said. "We have to take the evidence to the police, to the feds, to whoever will listen." Kieran. They killed our mother Maeve. They murdered her and made it look like an accident. And that man, Colin Moran, he is still out there, living his life, playing golf, sleeping in a warm bed. Free. I know. So how can you even hesitate? I looked at him. My little brother, 15 years old, so thin the blanket hung off his shoulders like a flag on a windless day. So certain that the right thing and the possible thing were the same thing. "Because of you, Kieran," I said quietly. "What?" "Your medication costs $300 a month. We have less than 2 weeks worth left. If we take this money right now tonight, we can afford to keep you alive for years. We can rent an apartment, buy food, see a real doctor, get you the specialist care you have needed your entire life. We can live, Kieran, actually live." Kieran stared at me. The fire crackled between us, casting shadows that moved across his face like clouds across a landscape. "You would take blood money to pay for my lungs. I would do anything to keep you alive." "And what about Mom?" His voice cracked on the word. That single kid of mom. A word he had no memory attached to. A word that was nothing but a photograph and a story about apple pie and a hole in his life shaped like a person he never got to know. "She is dead, Maeve. She has been dead for 10 years. But you and I are still here, and I do not want to survive on the price of her murder." He stood up. His thin frame shook with anger and grief, 2 forces pulling him in opposite directions, tearing at the seams of a body that was already too fragile for the world it had been born into. "I would rather die knowing the truth than live a lie. I would rather be poor and sick and right than rich and healthy and a coward." He was crying again. We both were. "Grandpa called himself a coward," Kieran said, his voice cracking like ice on a spring river. "He said his final hope was that we would be braver than he was." He looked at me, straight at me, with eyes that were our mother's eyes. "So be brave, Maeve. Be brave for Mom. Be brave for me." The argument ended without resolution. Kieran fell asleep on the bare mattress, his breathing ragged, his face streaked with dried tears, his inhaler clutched in one hand like a talisman. I sat alone by the dying fire, the letter in my hands, the choice pressing down on my chest like a stone. And then my phone buzzed. It was Elaine Whitmore. Her voice was sharp, urgent, stripped of the professional calm she usually wore like armor. "Maeve, I have been trying to reach you. Summit Ridge has increased their offer by 15%. It is a significant amount. But there is a deadline, 48 hours. After that, they withdraw completely. They will wait for the tax auction and buy the land for pennies on the dollar. 48 hours. There is something else," she continued. Her voice dropped. "Their representative, Preston Drake, he has been asking questions about you, about your brother, about why you traveled to Montana instead of simply signing the papers in Hartford. He wanted to know what you found at the property." My blood went cold, not cool, not chilled, cold. The kind of cold that starts in your spine and radiates outward until your fingertips go numb and the world takes on a hard, sharp clarity. "What kind of questions?" The kind that made me uncomfortable, Maeve. I have been practicing law for 31 years. I know the difference between due diligence and surveillance. Those were not the questions of a real estate company protecting an investment. Those were the questions of someone looking for something specific. She paused. I do not know what you found up there, but be careful. Something about this does not feel right. I hung up. My hand was steady. The fear was there, but it was underneath, held down by something stronger. Something that felt like the first stage of a decision being made. 5 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Judd Embry. Listen, I do not want to alarm you, he said. His voice was low, careful. The voice of a man who has learned that bad news is best delivered slowly. But there were some men in the bar tonight, city people, expensive coats, the kind of shoes that cost more than my truck. He paused. They were asking about the Connolly place, asking about two young people from back east. What did you tell them? Nothing. Told them I did not know any Connolly, told them the mountain was private property and they had best move along. Judd. They were not from the resort company, Maeve. I have seen real estate people before. Smooth, friendly. These men were something else. Something I have not seen in this valley in a long time. Not since Ronan was alive. Another pause. Longer. Before he passed, your grandfather said something to me. He said if anyone came asking about him after he was gone, I should tell his grandchildren one thing. What? Do not trust Summit Ridge. The words fell through me like a stone dropped into deep water. Summit Ridge was not a real estate company. Or if it was not only a real estate company, it was a front, a mechanism for getting close to the land, for gaining access to what was hidden inside it. They did not want 8 acres of mountain real estate. They wanted what was in the vault. They wanted to destroy the evidence before anyone could use it. Stasic's people had found us. Lock your doors tonight, Judd said. And if you have a decision to make, I would make it soon. I stood at the window. Outside, the darkness was absolute. The kind of darkness that only exists in places where the nearest electric light is miles away. The moon had gone behind the clouds. The trees were invisible. The steel door of the vault, still hanging open from this morning, was nothing but a slightly darker rectangle in the dark. And somewhere on the road below, maybe already climbing, the mountain men in expensive coats were coming. I looked at Kieran asleep on the mattress. I looked at the letter on the table. I looked at the vault outside the window full of evidence and money and the weight of 40 years of secrets. And I looked at the photograph of my mother propped against the kerosene lantern on the rough-hewn table. Her red hair, her smile, the shadow behind her eyes that I could see now, that I had always seen without understanding. Do not trust anyone they send. She had known. She had been trying to tell me, and she had died before she could say the rest. I picked up my phone. It was 3 in the morning. The fire had burned down to embers. My breath fogged in the cold air. Elaine Whitmore answered on the 5th ring. Maeve, it is 3 in the morning. What is wrong? I need you to reject the offer from Summit Ridge, I said. My voice was calm, calmer than I had any right to be. We are not selling the land. Silence on the line. A long, heavy silence. Maeve, I do not think you understand what you are giving up. I understand perfectly. And I need one more thing. I need you to connect me with someone. Not a real estate lawyer, a federal prosecutor. The best one you know. Someone who has been trying to bring down a man named Victor Stasic for a very long time. The silence stretched out. When Elaine spoke again, her voice was different. The professional distance was gone. What replaced it was something raw. How do you know that name? Because my grandfather left me everything I need to destroy him. Before we left the cabin, I made a decision that would follow me for the rest of my life. Kieran's medication was almost gone. 2 days worth. Maybe 3 if I have the doses which the doctors had always told me never to do. Without the medication, a single asthma attack in this altitude, in this cold, could put him in a hospital. And the nearest hospital was 2 hours away on a mountain road that might not be passable. I opened the footlocker with our names on it. I stared at the bundles of cash. Old bills wrapped in oilcloth. Blood money. The proceeds of a crime that had set in motion a chain of events ending with my mother's murder. And I took one bundle. $10,000. Enough for Kieran's medication. Enough for plane tickets to Hartford. Enough to eat and sleep and survive while we did what had to be done. My hands shook as I tucked it inside my jacket. Kieran watched me from the mattress. He did not speak. His face was still. His eyes tracked my hands as they closed the footlocker and latched it shut. He saw everything and said nothing, and the silence between us was louder than any argument. It is for you, I said. My voice came out rough, defensive. The voice of a person who knows they are doing something wrong for the right reasons, for your lungs. I will not let you die because I was too proud to. I know, he said quietly. I understand. But I saw something in his eyes, a flicker. Not anger, something worse than anger. Disappointment, sadness. The look of a boy who has just watched his sister compromise the very principle they had spent all night arguing about. We were already using the money we had sworn to reject. We were already making deals with the devil's currency. But what choice did we have? My brother's life was not a bargaining chip. It was not a principle. It was not an abstraction to be debated by firelight. It was a body with damaged lungs that needed medication to keep breathing, and I would not sacrifice that body on the altar of moral purity. Not even for justice, not even for our mother. I sealed the footlocker. I left the rest untouched. $800,000 minus $10,000. We would turn in everything else, every dollar, every ledger, every piece of evidence. But that one bundle would stay with me. A reminder that even the right choice comes with a cost. That righteousness is easy to preach and hard to practice. That the distance between who you want to be and who you have to be is measured in compromises that keep you up at night. I closed the vault. I shut the heavy steel door. And then I stood there in the dark, in the cold, with $10,000 of blood money against my chest and the sound of an engine somewhere on the mountain road below climbing. They were coming. We had to go. Now. We did not make it off the mountain that night. The engine sound I had heard from the cabin turned out to be Judd Embry's station wagon, grinding up the dirt road at 4 a.m. with his headlights off. He pulled into the clearing and killed the engine and sat there for a moment before getting out. And when he did, I saw that he was carrying a shotgun. It was an old Remington pump action, the blued steel worn silver at the edges from decades of handling. He held it the way a man holds something he has carried for so long, it has become a part of his body. Not with aggression, not with fear, with the calm, settled familiarity of a tool that has a purpose and knows it. Get your things, he said. His voice was low but steady. Both of you are staying at my place tonight. Judd, you do not have to. I was not asking. He looked past me toward the vault, its steel door still hanging open, the darkness inside absolute. Is there anything in there that needs to come with you? The footlockers, I said. Dozens of them. We cannot carry them all. Then we lock the door and we come back with the right people. He paused. The kind of people who come with badges and warrants and the authority of the United States government. I closed the vault. I could not re-weld the door, but the lock still worked. I turned the key and heard the tumblers engage that deep, resonant clunk, echoing from inside the rock like a heartbeat. It would hold. It had held for 5 years after Ronan's death. It could hold a few more days. Kieran was already at the station wagon, his backpack on his shoulders, his inhaler in his hand. He looked small in the darkness. 15 years old. Barely 120 pounds. Standing in the middle of the Montana wilderness at 4 a.m. with killers potentially on the same road. But his eyes were clear. His jaw was set. We drove down the mountain in silence, Judd navigating the rutted track with his headlights still off, steering by memory and moonlight. The man had driven this road for 20 years. He knew every curve, every washout, every place where the ruts were deep enough to swallow a tire. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the shotgun propped against the passenger seat within easy reach. No one followed us. Judd's house was a small, clapboard place on the edge of town, neat and spare, with a wood stove in the kitchen and a workshop out back that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. He gave Kieran the bedroom and me the couch, and he sat in a chair by the front door with the Remington across his knees and did not sleep. I know he did not sleep because I did not sleep either. I lay on that couch staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the tick of a clock on the mantel and the distant sound of Kieran's breathing through the thin wall. 4 seconds between inhales. Steady, safe, for now. At dawn, I called Elaine Whitmore. By noon, she had connected me with a man named Nolan Riggs. Riggs was the Deputy Attorney General for the state of Connecticut, but his reputation extended far beyond state lines. For 30 years, he had been building cases against Victor Stasek. For 30 years, those cases had fallen apart. Witnesses recanted or disappeared. Evidence was lost or contaminated. Informants turned up dead in circumstances that were always ruled accidental or natural or inconclusive. Stasek operated behind so many layers of insulation that the law could never get close enough to touch him. He was a ghost who ran an empire, a shadow that cast no shadow of its own. Riggs flew to Montana the next day. He arrived in Copper Creek in a rented SUV alone without fanfare or escort. He was an imposing man, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair cut close and eyes that had the flat, patient quality of a man who has been waiting for something his entire career and has learned not to hope for it but refuses to stop looking. He sat in Judd Embry's kitchen. He drank Judd's coffee, which was strong enough to strip paint, and he listened as I told him everything. I told him about the orphanage and the cardboard box and the photograph of our mother. I told him about Elaine Whitmore's phone call and the inheritance in the sealed vault. I told him about the footlockers and the money and the letter. I told him about Cormac Daly and the heist and the murder of Siobhan Connolly Gallagher. I told him about Summit Ridge and the men in expensive coats and Ronan's warning. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet. The clock ticked on the mantel. Judd stood by the stove with his arms crossed. Kieran sat beside me, his hands folded on the table, his breathing tight but controlled. Riggs was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the window. He looked at me. Your grandfather, he said slowly, was either the bravest man I have ever heard of or the most foolish. Maybe both, I said. Maybe. He leaned forward. His elbows were on the table and his fingers were laced together and his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that felt like standing in front of a searchlight. I need to see the evidence. All of it. We drove up the mountain in a convoy, Riggs in his rented SUV, Judd in his station wagon, Kieran and I in the back seat watching the tree line for movement that did not belong. The cabin looked the same. The vault door was still closed, still locked. No fresh tracks in the mud. No sign that anyone had been there since we left. I opened the lock. I pulled the door. And I watched Nolan Riggs walk into the bunker that my grandfather had built. His reaction was something I will never forget. He moved along the shelves slowly, his hands hovering over the footlockers without touching them, the way a man moves through a cathedral. He opened one, then another, then a third. His hands were trembling. I could see it. This man who had spent 30 years chasing a ghost, who had watched case after case crumble, who had buried informants, inconsoled witnesses, and swallowed defeat so many times it must have tasted like nothing anymore. His hands were trembling. He turned the pages of the ledgers. His breath caught. He looked at the photographs, the bank records, the wire transfers, the coded communications, the sworn statements from men who had decided that their fear of Stasek was finally outweighed by their exhaustion. My God, he whispered, it is all here. Everything. He stopped at one folder, stared at it for a long time. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his cheek. Is that him? I asked. Call him Moran, the driver. Riggs nodded slowly. He is living in Florida now, has been for 11 years, retirement community, gated, golf course, swimming pool. The kind of place where a man goes to forget what he has done. He held up the folder. This proves it. Bank transfers from a shell company linked to Stasek to an account in Moran's name. Coded communications referencing the date and location of the crash. A direct documented line from Victor Stasek to Colin Moran to your mother's car. He closed the folder. He looked at me, and then he looked at Kieran. Two kids from an orphanage standing in a vault full of a dead man's secrets, choosing justice over safety. If you do this, he said, and his voice was careful now, measured the voice of a man who understands the weight of what he is about to say. If you testify, if you hand over this evidence, your lives will change. Permanently. Stasek is old and sick, but his organization is not. They will come for you. We can protect you. Federal witness protection. New names, new location, new lives. But it will mean leaving everything behind. I looked at Kieran. He was pale. His breathing was shallow, the altitude pressing on his lungs like a hand. But his eyes were steady, absolutely steady. We already have nothing, he said. We have been ghosts our whole lives. At least this way, we will be ghosts with a purpose. Riggs studied us for a long moment. Two children, really. Standing in a concrete bunker on a mountainside in Montana, surrounded by the wreckage of their grandfather's life, choosing the hard thing. Your grandfather would be proud, he said finally. Both of you. We were preparing to leave the mountain when they came. It was late afternoon. Riggs was on the phone with his office in Hartford, arranging for an FBI evidence response team to fly out and catalog the contents of the vault. Judd was loading supplies into his station wagon. Kieran was in the cabin, resting his breathing worse from a day spent in the cold mountain air. I was standing on the porch when I heard the engine. Not Judd's wheezing station wagon. Not the rented SUV. Something else. Something heavier. A black Suburban with tinted windows climbing the dirt road with a confidence that said its driver had been here before, or at least had studied the route. It pulled into the clearing and stopped. The engine idled. The windows stayed dark. Then the doors opened and two men stepped out. They wore expensive overcoats. Dark wool tailored, the kind of coats that have never been anywhere near a Montana dirt road. Their shoes were polished leather. Their faces were clean-shaven and expressionless. One was tall and thin, with gray hair combed straight back. The other was shorter, broader, with the compact build of a man whose muscle had not yet surrendered to age. The tall one smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has practiced smiling the way some people practice piano. Technically proficient, emotionally vacant. "Ms. Gallagher," he said, "we are from Summit Ridge Corporation. We understand there may have been some miscommunication regarding the offer on this property." I stood on the porch. I did not move. I did not invite them closer. Behind me through the cabin wall, I could hear Kieran coughing. "There was no miscommunication," I said. "I rejected the offer. The land is not for sale." The tall man nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable response to a perfectly reasonable question and not a threat assessment disguised as small talk. "Of course, that is your right. But we wanted to make sure you understood the full picture. A young woman new to the area carrying the responsibility of a minor with significant medical needs." He paused. Let the words settle. "Medication is expensive. Specialists are far away. Winter up here is no place for a boy with compromised lungs." He knew about Kieran. He knew about the asthma. He knew about the medication. This was not a real estate negotiation. This was a message. The same kind of message that two men in expensive coats had delivered to my grandfather decades ago, sitting at his kitchen table, showing him photographs of his teenage daughter. The shorter man had not spoken. He stood slightly behind and to the left, his hands at his sides, his eyes moving constantly, scanning the clearing, noting the vehicles, noting the open vault door, noting everything. "A smart young woman would sign the papers," the tall one said. His smile had not changed. "Take the very generous offer, start a new life somewhere warm, somewhere with good hospitals." My heart was hammering. I could feel it in my throat, in my wrists, in the pulse behind my eyes. But my voice when it came out was steady, steadier than I had any right to expect. "I have a federal attorney on this property right now," I said. "His name is Nolan Riggs. He is the Deputy Attorney General for the state of Connecticut. And I think you already know that." The tall man's smile flickered. Just for a moment, a hairline crack in the porcelain. "I think you should leave," I said. "And I think you should tell whoever sent you that the vault is empty, that there was nothing inside but a dead man's junk. Tell them whatever you want, but do not come back here." The two men looked at each other. Something passed between them. A calculation. A recalibration. The tall one straightened his coat. "We wish you the best, Ms. Gallagher, truly." They got back in the Suburban, the doors closed, the engine revved, and they drove back down the mountain road and disappeared into the trees. My knees buckled. I sat down on the porch steps and pressed my hands against my face and breathed. Just breathed. In and out, the way I had taught myself to breathe when the panic came. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The same rhythm I used to count Kieran's breaths. Judd appeared around the corner of the cabin. He was holding the Remington. His face was stone. "Heard the whole thing," he said. "Stayed out of sight in case they tried something." He sat down beside me on the steps. The shotgun rested across his knees. "You did good," he said quietly. "Your grandfather would have crumbled. He would have crumbled because he spent his whole life crumbling. But you did not." He looked out at the tree line where the Suburban had disappeared. "Nobody threatens Ronan's grandchildren on this mountain. Not while I am still breathing." Riggs appeared in the doorway behind us. His phone was still in his hand. His face was grim. "FBI evidence response team will be here in 36 hours, he said. "Until then, none of us leaves this property alone. And tomorrow you and your brother are going to Virginia. Federal protection." No arguments. There were no arguments. The next 6 weeks existed in a strange, suspended reality. Kieran and I lived in a safe house in Northern Virginia, a nondescript suburban ranch house on a cul-de-sac where the lawns were mowed by federal marshals and the neighbors were all aliases. 2 marshals rotated shifts. They were quiet, professional, and armed. They cooked surprisingly good pasta and taught Kieran to play chess while we waited for the machinery of justice to turn. And it turned, slowly at first. The arrest began small. An accountant in New Jersey who had laundered money for Stasek for 15 years. A retired police captain in Boston who had buried investigations in exchange for monthly deposits to an offshore account. A mid-level operator in Philadelphia who had coordinated bribes to 3 different judges over the course of a decade. One by one they fell, and one by one they started talking. The evidence from the vault was overwhelming. Ronan Connolly Cormac Daly, whatever name you called him, had built a case more thorough than anything the federal government had managed in 3 decades of trying. Every ledger was cross-referenced. Every bank record was annotated. Every name was connected to every other name by a web of transactions and communications that left no room for ambiguity or denial. The prosecutors called it the most comprehensive criminal evidence archive they had ever encountered from a single individual source. I called it a dead man's penance. We watched the news from the safe house. Kieran and I sat on the couch in that bland suburban living room with its beige carpet and its government-issued curtains, and we watched the headlines scroll across the screen. Organized crime ring dismantled. Federal indictments unsealed. Dozens arrested in multi-state operation. And then, on a rainy night in November, 6 weeks after we had opened the vault, they came for Stasek himself. Victor Stasek was 78 years old. He was dying of pancreatic cancer, which had been eating him from the inside for 2 years. He lived in a penthouse in Manhattan that occupied the entire top floor of a building he owned through a chain of shell companies so long that it took federal investigators 3 weeks just to trace the ownership. The penthouse was filled with original artwork and silk sheets and furniture that cost more than the house I grew up in. They found him in his bedroom. He was sitting in an armchair by the window looking out at the city lights reflected in the rain. He was wearing a bathrobe. He looked small. "Who?" he said as they put the handcuffs on his wrists. His voice was a rasp, thin and dry, the voice of a man whose body was already halfway gone. "Who did this?" The lead agent looked at him. "Ronan Connolly," he said, "from beyond the grave." Victor Stasek did not live to see his trial. He died of cardiac arrest in his cell 3 days after his arrest. The medical examiner ruled it heart failure. I think it was the weight something else. I think it was the weight of 40 years of evil finally settling on a chest that was too weak to carry it anymore. I think it was justice arriving late and in disguise the way it so often does. But Stasek's death did not end the case. It only cleared the stage for the reckoning that mattered most. Colin Moran was arrested in Sarasota, Florida 2 weeks after Stasek died. He was 63 years old. He lived in a retirement community with a golf course and a heated pool and a clubhouse where they served cocktails at 4 in the afternoon. He played golf on Tuesdays and bridge on Fridays, and he walked his dog along the manicured paths every evening at sunset. He had lived this way for 11 years. 11 years of sunshine and leisure and the quiet, comfortable anonymity of a man who believes he has gotten away with everything. He was wrong. They arrested him at his front door on a Tuesday morning. He was wearing golf shoes. He had a tea time in an hour. The trial lasted 4 months. It was held in federal court in Hartford, Connecticut, because that was where the conspiracy had been charged, and because that was where Siobhan Connolly Gallagher had lived and died and been buried under a lie for 10 years. The courtroom was modern, all pale wood and recessed lighting, and it was packed every day with reporters and spectators and retired law enforcement officers who had spent their careers chasing Stasek's shadow and never catching it. The case had attracted national attention. The story of a dead man's vault on a Montana mountain built over 5 years by a guilt-haunted grandfather used by his orphaned grandchildren to bring down a criminal empire and solve their mother's murder. It was the kind of story that journalists dream about and prosecutors build careers on and ordinary people follow because it contains something they recognize: the hunger for justice, the belief that the truth, even when it arrives decades late, it still matters. I testified on a Wednesday in March. The courtroom was silent when I took the stand. I could hear the ventilation system humming. I could hear the scratch of a court reporter's keyboard. I could hear my own heartbeat. I sat in the witness chair and I looked at Colin Moran across the courtroom. He was smaller than I had imagined, shorter, thinner. His hair was white and his face was tanned from 11 years of Florida sunshine. And his eyes were the pale, watery blue of a man who has spent his whole life looking at the world without really seeing it. He did not look like a killer. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked like the kind of man who holds the door open at the grocery store and says please and thank you and smiles at strangers. That was the most disturbing thing about him. The prosecutor walked me through the evidence: the bank transfers, the coded messages, the timeline that connected Stasek's order to Moran's action to my mother's death, with the clean, unbroken precision of a line drawn between 3 points on a map. And then the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. He tried to discredit the evidence. He argued that the ledgers could have been fabricated, that a dead man's records were inherently unreliable, that a convicted felon's confession was not proof of anything except his own guilt. He was good. He was thorough. He was earning his fee. But the evidence was better. Ronan had been meticulous. Every document was corroborated by at least 2 independent sources. Every bank record matched records obtained independently through federal subpoena. The case was airtight, built by a man who knew that his grandchildren would be standing in this courtroom someday and who had spent the last years of his life making sure that when that day came, the truth would be unbreakable. Kieran testified the next day. He was 16 by then. He sat in the witness chair with his inhaler in his pocket and his hands flat on his knees, and he spoke clearly and calmly about growing up in an orphanage, about the mother he could not remember, about the grandfather he had never met, about the choice we had made in a concrete bunker on a Montana mountainside. And then the moment came that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Colin Moran was given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing. He stood up, he buttoned his jacket, he looked at me across the courtroom, and he said 6 words. I was just following orders. The courtroom was silent. I did not plan what happened next. I did not rehearse it. The words came from the same place that every true thing comes from, the place below thought, below strategy, below the careful calculations of a mind trained by years in the system to always think 3 moves ahead. I stood up. My mother was just driving home. The judge did not admonish me for speaking out of turn. The prosecutor did not object. The courtroom remained silent for a long time. Colin Moran was convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in a federal penitentiary. He was 63 years old. He would die in prison. The official record of Siobhan Connolly Gallagher's death was amended. The word accident was removed. In its place, the word murder. After 10 years, the lie had been corrected. After 10 years, the truth was finally written down in a place where it could not be erased. The money was gone. All $800,000 of it, minus the $10,000 I had taken for Kieran's medication, was seized as evidence and subsequently forfeited to the federal government as proceeds of a criminal enterprise. We did not fight it. We did not appeal. We did not hire a lawyer to argue for a portion to be returned. We did not want it. Some things cannot be bought, and some prices are too high to pay. That money had been earned in a crime that set in motion a chain of events ending with a woman in a blue dress dead at an intersection. Every dollar in that footlocker was stained with a stain that no amount of washing would remove. Letting it go was not sacrifice. It was relief. But the land remained. As part of the settlement, and in recognition of our cooperation with the federal investigation, all back taxes on the property were forgiven. The 8 acres in the Bitterroot Mountains, the cabin, the vault, they belong to us now. Free and clear. No debt, no encumbrance, no shadow. Ours. Kieran and I returned to Copper Creek in the spring. The snow had melted, revealing a landscape I had never seen. The mountainside that had been white and silent and forbidding was now green and alive, covered in a carpet of new grass and wildflowers that pushed up through the dead leaves with a stubbornness that reminded me of my brother. The air was warm and smelled of damp earth and pine sap and the particular sweetness of things coming back to life after a long, cold death. The cabin looked the same, small, weathered. Its porch still sagged, its roof still leaked, its windows still rattled in the wind, but the sunlight softened everything. And when we stepped onto that porch and looked out at the clearing and the mountains beyond, something shifted inside me. Something that had been clenched for 18 years, a fist at the center of my chest, slowly uncurled. Now what? Kieran asked. I laughed. It was the same question he had asked when we first arrived in Copper Creek months ago, standing in the dark with our backpacks and our $300 and our fading hope. But everything was different now. Now we build, I said. The work was hard. Neither of us knew anything about construction. On the first day, I picked up a hammer and swung it at a nail and hit my own thumb so hard that my vision went white and I could not hold anything for a week. Kieran tried to help, but his lungs fought the altitude and the dust and the exertion, and I had to make him stop and rest more often than he wanted. But we did not quit. We learned. We failed. We tried again. We drove nails crooked and pulled them out and drove them straight. We cut boards too short and measured them again. We made every mistake there was to make, and we made some of them twice. And then Judd Embry showed up on the second day. He came in his station wagon with a toolbox in the bed and a thermos of coffee on the passenger seat and the same battered canvas cap on his head. He climbed out slowly, his joints protesting every movement, and he walked up to the porch and set the toolbox down and looked at me. Your grandfather helped me once, he said. Gave me work when I had nothing. Gave me a reason to get out of bed when I did not have one. Figured I would return the favor. He stayed for 3 weeks. He taught me how to read a level, how to cut a board straight, how to sister a joist that had rotted through, how to patch a roof so the water runs off instead of in. He was patient in the way that only old men who have made every mistake themselves can be patient, correcting without criticizing, showing without telling, letting me fail, and then quietly demonstrating the right way as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Martha Pruitt, who owned the general store, started bringing supplies every few days. Nails, screws, sandpaper, rolls of insulation. She never asked for payment, never left a bill, never even mentioned it. Ronan fixed my truck once, she said. Middle of winter. Drove up here in a blizzard because I called and said I was stranded. Spent 3 hours under the hood in the snow. Wouldn't take a dime. Just said we take care of each other up here. She set down a bag of roofing nails on the porch. So that is what I am doing. Two local contractors came by on a Saturday. They had heard about the story, about the orphans who turned down the resort money. The kids who were rebuilding the old Connolly place with their own hands. They worked for free. They showed us how to rewire the electrical so it was safe, how to install a water heater, how to insulate the walls so that winter would not kill us. They worked beside us for 2 weekends, refusing every offer of payment because their fathers had known Ronan, and Ronan had helped their fathers, and that was how things worked in this valley. I began to understand something. Our grandfather had not just been hiding on this mountain. He had not just been a hermit sealing himself away from the world in guilt and shame. He had been living here, quietly, carefully, helping the people around him in small ways that added up to something much larger than any single act. A truck fixed in a blizzard, a job offered when none was available, a hand extended to a neighbor who needed one. He had been building a community, a family of strangers who looked out for each other because someone had looked out for them first. And now, years after his death, that community was looking out for us. By autumn, the cabin was transformed. We had rebuilt the porch so it stood level and strong. We had reinforced the foundation with new concrete footings. We had replaced the roof with proper shingles that would hold against the mountain snow. The windows no longer rattled. The fireplace drew properly, pulling the smoke up and out instead of filling the room. The bedroom had 2 beds now and a small desk where Kieran could study. The vault remained. It would always remain, carved into the rock face. But we had cleared it out. The footlockers were gone, carried away by FBI agents in evidence bags. The shelves that had once held 40 years of secrets now held tools and paint cans and bags of seed for the garden we were planting. We replaced the steel door with a wooden one and painted it green. Above it, we carved words into the concrete lintel, where truth was kept. 2025. A reminder of what this place had been and what it had cost. Kieran's health improved. It happened slowly, the way all real healing happens, not in a dramatic moment, but in the quiet accumulation of better days. The mountain air, the doctor said, was actually good for him. Cleaner than the city, less pollution, less mold, less of the invisible particulate matter that had been irritating his lungs for 15 years in the damp basements and aging buildings of the foster care system. He still needed medication. He would always need medication. But the attacks grew less frequent. The trips to the emergency room, which had been a regular feature of our life in Connecticut, stopped entirely. The fear that I carried every night, the fear of waking up to silence where his breathing should have been, did not disappear. But it softened. It became manageable. It became a concern instead of a terror. We enrolled him in the local high school. He made friends for the first time in his life. He joined the debate team, which surprised no one who had ever seen him argue. He started talking about college, about the future, about possibilities that had never existed before. I got a job with one of the contractors who had helped us rebuild the cabin. I learned the trade properly. I discovered that I was good with my hands, that measuring and cutting and joining and building gave me a satisfaction I had never experienced, that there was a particular kind of peace in taking something broken and making it whole, something raw and making it finished, something that did not exist and bringing it into the world solid and real and built to last. And every evening we came home to the cabin that our grandfather had built on a mountainside in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was not much. It was small, and it was remote, and it was a long way from anywhere. But it was ours, truly ours. Not assigned by the state, not temporary, not conditional. Ours. 5 years passed. Kieran graduated from high school with honors. He was accepted to Montana State University on a full academic scholarship. He wanted to study criminal justice. Someone has to make sure the system works, he said. Someone has to fight for the people who cannot fight for themselves, the people who do not have a grandfather who built them a vault full of evidence, the people who have to fight with nothing. I understood. It was the same reason I had opened that door all those years ago. The same reason I had said no to the money and yes to the truth. Some things are worth more than comfort. Some fights are worth more than safety. I was 23 now. I had my own truck, my own tools, my own small construction business. I took jobs around the valley building and repairing for the same people who had helped us when we had nothing. The cycle continued. The community that Ronan had planted like a seed in thin mountain soil had grown into something real and lasting and strong. Judd Embry was slowing down. I noticed it first in the way he climbed the porch steps, his right hand gripping the railing tighter than it used to. Then in the way he would pause mid-sentence, sometimes searching for a word that had wandered off like a sheep from a flock. He was 77 years old. His back was bent from decades of labor. His hands, those enormous scarred hands that had taught me to hold a hammer and read a level were stiff in the mornings now. I am not going anywhere, he would say when I asked about his health. Too stubborn to die. The mountain has been trying to kill me for 50 years, and I am still here. But last winter, the mountain finally won. Judson Embry passed away in his sleep on a night in January when the temperature dropped to 20 below and the snow came down so thick you could not see the tree line from the porch. He went quietly the way he had lived, without drama, without complaint, without asking anyone for anything. I found him the next morning. I had been coming by every day that winter to check on him, to bring firewood to make sure the old man was eating. The door was unlocked the way it always was because Judd believed that a locked door in the mountains was an insult to your neighbors. The stove was cold. The house was silent. He was in his chair by the window, the same chair he had sat in that first night, with the Remington across his knees, watching over two frightened orphans he had decided to protect because a dead friend had asked him to. He looked peaceful, smaller than I remembered, the way people always look smaller when the thing that animated them has departed. We buried him in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley he had called home for half a century. The whole town came. Martha from the general store, the contractors who had helped us rebuild, the bartender from the Ridgeline, people whose names I was still learning, who had known Judd for decades, who told stories about him that made us laugh and then made us cry and then made us laugh again because that is what stories about good men do. He left me his toolbox, the same one he had brought to the cabin that first spring, the same one he had used to teach me everything I know about building. The tools inside were worn and oiled and perfectly maintained, each one nested in its place with the care of a man who understood that good tools are not possessions. They are partnerships. I use them every day. On the anniversary of our mother's death, Kieran and I drove east, back to Connecticut, back to the cemetery where Siobhan Connolly Gallagher had been buried 10 years ago in a grave marked by a simple stone. But now there were two graves, side by side. The first read, Siobhan Connolly Gallagher, 1982 to 2015. Beloved daughter, devoted mother. Her courage lives on in her children. And beside it, Ronan Connolly, 1950 to 2020. Born Cormac Daly, he found redemption in the truth. After the trial, after the convictions, after the truth had been written into the official record in ink that could not be erased, we had petitioned to have our grandfather's remains moved here, to rest beside the daughter he had lost, the daughter whose murder had haunted him for a decade and driven him to spend the last winter years of his life alone on a mountain building, a weapon of justice, out of guilt and grief and love. We stood before those graves for a long time. The sun was setting. The sky over Connecticut was not the hard crystalline blue of Montana. It was softer, grayer, the kind of sky that holds its light close instead of throwing it across the horizon. Kieran placed flowers on our mother's headstone, white lilies. Her favorite according to Judd, who had known things about our family that we were still discovering, one story at a time. I placed a small stone on our grandfather's grave, an old tradition, a marker that says someone was here, someone remembers. Do you think he is at peace now? Kieran asked. I thought about it. I thought about a young man named Cormac Daly who made a terrible choice in Boston 40 years ago. I thought about the husband and father named Ronan Connolly who built a life on a lie and lost everything when the lie collapsed. I thought about the old man on the mountain who spent 5 years alone, building a case that he knew he would never live to see, resolved, trusting that someday his grandchildren would be brave enough to finish what he started. I think he is, I said. I think he has been waiting for this, since the day she died, waiting for someone to set it right, waiting for permission to rest. We stood there until the last of the light faded. Then we drove west, back to Montana, back to the mountains, back home. The cabin sits in a clearing in the Bitterroot Mountains, now surrounded by wildflowers in the summer and silence in the winter. The porch is level and strong. The roof is solid. The chimney is straight. Smoke rises from it every evening, curling up into a sky so full of stars it looks like someone spilled a bag of diamonds across a sheet of black velvet. The vault is still there, carved into the rock face. It will always be there, but the steel door is gone. In its place is a wooden door painted green with a simple sign above it that reads Tool Shed. Inside are rakes and shovels and bags of potting soil and the collected evidence of a life being built instead of hidden. Some nights when the sky is clear and the wind is calm and the only sound is the creek running over rocks at the bottom of the clearing, I sit on the porch and look up at the mountains. I think about everything that led me here. The orphanage, the cardboard box, the photograph, the phone call, the bus ride, the vault, the letter, the choice. On the windowsill inside, there are 3 photographs in simple wooden frames. Our mother, Smiling into the sun, her red hair blowing in a wind, we will never feel her eyes bright with a happiness that was real even if it was temporary, even if she knew somewhere beneath the smile that the shadows were closing in. Our grandfather, young and strong, standing in front of a cabin that was just beginning to be built, his sleeves rolled up, his hands dirty, looking at the camera with an expression that could be hope or could be fear or could be both, because sometimes those two things are the same. And us, Maeve and Kieran, taken on the day we returned to Copper Creek after the trial, after the justice, after everything. We are standing on the rebuilt porch of the cabin, our arms around each other, squinting into the same Montana sun that our grandfather must have squinted into 1,000 times. We look tired in that photograph, worn, older than our years, but we are smiling because we are home. I want to leave you with one final thought because I think it matters. I think it might be the only thing that matters. What we inherit is rarely what we expect. Sometimes it is money, sometimes it is land. Sometimes it is a secret that has been sealed in a vault inside a mountain for 5 years, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough or desperate enough to open it. But sometimes, if we are lucky, what we inherit is something that cannot be measured or counted or deposited in a bank. Our grandfather left us a sealed cave full of secrets and sorrow. But what he really left us was permission. Permission to be braver than he was. Permission to choose truth over comfort, justice over safety, the harder right over the easier wrong. Permission to take the broken pieces of a family that had been scattered by violence and cowardice and time, and to build from those pieces something new, something strong, something that could hold. That is the only inheritance that matters. It is the only one that lasts.